At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. The cuts were too clean, the body arranged with too much purpose. This wasn't a murder, it was a tactical communication. The work was displayed in the town's only cantina, a repurposed ore hauler's mess hall still smelling of stale beer and sweat. The miners, what few were left on this forgotten rock, gave the piece a wide berth. They stood in a clotted semicircle, their faces a mixture of slack-jawed horror and morbid fascination. Brody was suspended from a ceiling beam, his own enforcement baton rammed through his back and out his chest, pinning him to the rough-hewn metal. His skin, or what was left of it, had been meticulously flayed and draped over the cantina's long, scarred bar like a forgotten coat. It was a Myrmidon honor killing, a message. "Gods above," one of the younger miners, a kid named Cole, whispered. He looked like he was about to vomit up his morning ration bar. "Who would do that?" Jack didn't answer. He ignored the stench of blood and viscera, a smell he knew too well. His focus was on the details, the deliberate arrangement of the body. The cuts were clean, parting the flesh with an economy that spoke of a monomolecular edge. He ran a gloved finger along the doorframe, his touch light as a ghost. He felt it. A series of microscopic scores in the metal, almost invisible. The signature of a ghost entry team's monofilament saw. He straightened up, his joints creaking a protest against the planet's heavy gravity. His gaze swept the room, seeing it as a tactical space, a system of stress points and structural weaknesses. The habits of a soldier layered over the instincts of a man who knew how things break. "You know something, Jack?" The voice belonged to a grizzled old-timer, a man named Rees who'd lost an arm to a rock crusher years ago. His remaining hand was clenched into a white-knuckled fist. "You got that look, the one you had right before the Tantalus truce went to hell." Jack pulled his gaze from the doorframe and met the man's eyes. He offered nothing, no confirmation, no denial. He just turned and walked out of the cantina, the murmuring crowd parting for him like he was the Reaper himself. The red dust of Greaves' End swirled around his worn boots. He knew who did this. He'd taught them how. And he knew with a certainty that settled like a block of ice in his gut that they hadn't come for a forgotten backwater sheriff. They were tidying up, erasing loose ends, and he was the last one. The clang and shudder of Milo's ore loader echoed across the flats. The rig was a hulking beast of rust and iron, a relic from the colony's boom years, but Milo kept it running through sheer stubbornness and a savant-like understanding of its combustion engine. Jack found him perched on the edge of the loading ramp, a flask of cheap hooch in one hand, watching the automated conveyance belts dump refined cobalt into the rig's cavernous hold. "Heard about Brody," Milo said without looking up. His voice was a low rumble, layered with years of whiskey and engine fumes. "Nasty business." "Rain in the forecast, Milo," Jack said, his voice quiet. It was old code, platoon code. Trouble's coming. Milo took a long pull from the flask and chuckled a dry, rattling sound. "Still with the spooky talk, Jack. Look around. We're ghosts already. Forgotten men on a forgotten world. Who's coming for us? A tax collector?" "This isn't a joke." Jack's gaze was fixed on the horizon, a wavering line of heat and rust. "They left a calling card. Myrmidon work. Elite." "So, the Empire and the Alliance are rattling sabers again. Some spec ops team hit the wrong dirtball. Took out a local lawman to send a message. It's got nothing to do with us." Milo finally turned, his eyes bloodshot but clear. He was a big man, gone to seed, but the frame of the soldier was still there under the mechanic's grime. "We're just old junkers now, Jack. Nobody's hunting us." "They're my work, Milo. I know the signature." Milo's smile faded. He looked at Jack, really looked at him, and saw the thing that never quite left his friend's eyes. the cold, calculating stillness of the cleaner. "You really think they'd come all the way out here for you? After all this time? The file's closed, Jack. You made sure of it." "A good cleaner always double-checks his work," Jack said, "and so does a good assassin. They're tying up the last thread of the Tantalus mandate, the last person who knows how they were built." "Which is you." Jack nodded once. Milo sighed and took another swig from his flask. He offered it to Jack, who shook his head. "So, what's the play? Grab your old kit, go Rambo?" "Get out, Milo. Take the rig. Head for the southern wastes. There are caves there, deep ones. The scanners can't penetrate the ore seams. Lie low until the quarterly freighter leaves." Milo stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. It was the sound of a man who'd accepted his place in the universe. "Run. Jack, this rig is all I've got. This rock is all I've got. My war is over. I'm not running from shadows." He slapped Jack's shoulder, a heavy, friendly impact. "You're just spooked. Go have a drink. Things will look better in the morning." Jack watched him turn back to the loading ramp, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical labor. He knew he couldn't force him. You couldn't make a man run when he'd already decided he was home. "Just keep your head down, Milo," Jack said to the other man's back. "Always do," Milo grunted, his attention already back on the flow of ore. Jack walked away, the dust swallowing the sound of his footsteps, leaving only the rhythmic clang of the loader behind him. It was the last time he would hear it. The next morning, the silence from the flats was louder than any engine. Jack knew before he even got there. The air was still, heavy. Milo's rig sat inert, a monument of silent steel against the bruised purple dawn. The loading ramp was down, a silent invitation. Jack didn't enter through the ramp. He scaled the side of the rig, his boots finding purchase on handholds worn smooth by years of use. He slipped in through a maintenance hatch on the roof, dropping into the upper gantry with a soft thud. The interior of the rig smelled of cold metal, stale air, and copper. He found Milo in the cockpit. He wasn't displayed like Brody. This wasn't a message for the public. This was a message for one man. Milo was strung up from the ceiling, his large frame suspended by a length of monomolecular wire so fine it was nearly invisible, slicing deep into the support beam. His body was arranged in a specific pose, seated in his pilot's chair, hands on the controls, head slumped forward as if asleep. But one of his arms was extended, finger pointing directly at a small data slate left on the console. It was a classic tactical tableau, a pointer. Look here. A lesson Jack had drilled into his students 100 times. Direct the enemy's attention, control the narrative of the scene. They hadn't just killed him, they'd used him. They'd turned his death into a sentence in a conversation only Jack could understand. The sentence was clear. We know you're here. We were taught by the best. And now, the lesson is over. The absolute certainty of it settled over Jack, washing away the last dregs of hope. They weren't just killing loose ends. They were hunting him. This was his debt, his sin. He had been the architect of the Empire's finest monsters, a cog in the foolish political machine that birthed them. And now they had come home. His guilt wasn't a phantom anymore. It had a face, a method, and it had just murdered his only friend. He didn't touch the data slate. He didn't need to. He knew what it would say. It would be his own file, his own face, his own history. A final confirmation before the hunt began. He backed away, slipping out of the rig as silently as he entered. The time for running was over. The time for regret was a luxury he could no longer afford. It was time to unmake what he had made. The heavy steel door of his workshop slammed shut with the sound of a tomb sealing. Jack leaned against it, the metal cool against his back. He walked to a small, cluttered workbench and poured a heavy glass of amber whiskey from a bottle with no label. He downed it in 3 long, burning swallows. The fire in his belly did nothing to warm the ice in his veins. His eyes fell on a large military-grade weapons case under the bench. It was triple-locked, shielded, and contained his past: a pulse rifle, a kinetic penetrator sidearm, high-grade explosives, military comms, the tools of a soldier. He nudged the case with the toe of his boot, then shook his head. They're expecting a soldier. The thought was cold and clear, cutting through the alcoholic haze. They're trained for a soldier's kit. They know every tactic, every weapon system, every field regulation I ever taught them. A switch flipped in his mind. It was a tangible thing, a click of tumblers falling into place. The hunted, drunken junker receded, sinking back into the shadows of his skull. In his place, something older and colder surfaced: the cleaner. His eyes, no longer distant and clouded, scanned the cavernous garage. It was no longer a workshop. It was an armory, a kill box. His internal monologue became a flat tactical inventory, a litany of lethal possibilities. The pressure plate from the old conveyor belt, rusted, but the spring mechanism is sound. A simple circuit: trip the plate, close the relay. The solenoid on the main valve of the 50-ton hydraulic press gets the jolt. 30 tons of force. Not clean. Final. The arc welder. Power packs fully charged. The amperage is high enough to turn their armored shells to slag. Range is limited, 3 meters. An ambush weapon. The canisters of acetylene and oxygen. Unstable. A single round. A chain reaction. Area denial. He walked over to a small wooden footlocker. It was old, the initials TH carved into the lid. He opened it. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, was his grandfather's antique: a Colt Model 1911, a .45 caliber slug thrower, a museum piece. He picked it up. The weight was solid, familiar. He worked the slide, the sound a crisp, mechanical sh-sh. He ejected the magazine. 7 rounds. Heavy, subsonic. He slammed the magazine home. No fancy electronics, no energy signature, just steel, lead, and gunpowder. He began to build. The drunk was gone. The soldier was a liability. The mechanic, the junker, the man who knew how to turn scrap into death, he was ready to go to work. Dusk bled across the rust-red plains of Gravesend, painting the landscape in shapes of blood and shadow. Inside the garage, Jack sat in the darkness, the old Colt heavy in his hand. He was a statue carved from patience and spite. He'd made his preparations. The stage was set. He didn't have to wait long. They moved like smoke, 2 silhouettes detaching from the deeper gloom outside. There was no sound, not even the crunch of gravel. One was slender, a scout. The other was broader, a breacher. They flowed to the main door, their forms barely disturbing the air. Jack watched them on a small, grainy monitor wired to a pinhole camera he'd mounted above the doorframe. They didn't try the handle. They didn't plan to charge. The breacher raised a hand, and a low hum vibrated through the steel as a monofilament saw began to slice through the lock. They were following his own doctrine: never use a door like a door. The lock fell away with a soft metallic sigh. The scout slipped inside, a wraith in the near total darkness. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its tall, shell-armored form eerily silent. Its head swiveled, multi-spectral optics cutting through the shadows. It took 3 steps inside, passing under the immense silent shadow of the dormant hydraulic press, then a 4th, clearing the doorway for the breacher. Its foot came down on a sheet of loose durasteel plating Jack had laid over the floor. Click. The sound was small, insignificant, but it was the only sound that mattered. For a split second, nothing happened. The scout froze, processing the anomaly. Then, the night erupted. It wasn't the clean, quick crunch of a Hollywood death. The 50-ton hydraulic press, its activation circuit now closed, slammed down with a colossal grinding tear. It was the sound of a mountain falling. The scout was caught mid-stride, its upper torso crushed instantly. The sound was wet, a ghastly fusion of screaming metal, splintering alien bone, and rupturing organs. Its shell-like plates, tougher than any body armor, shattered like porcelain, and a black viscous liquid sprayed across the concrete floor. The breacher, standing in the doorway, was momentarily stunned. Not by the sight, it was conditioned for gore, but by the sound. The sheer industrial violence of it was outside its combat parameters. That half-second of auditory shock was all Jack needed. He erupted from the shadows behind a stack of old tires, the heavy-duty arc welder already in his hands. He didn't aim for the chest or head. He aimed for the faceplate. He jammed the twin prongs of the welder against the ghost's helmet and squeezed the trigger. A brilliant blue-white light vaporized the darkness. The air crackled, and the smell of burnt ceramic and cooking meat filled the garage. The ghost convulsed, a high-pitched shriek tearing from its vocalizer, a sound of pure electronic agony as thousands of amps melted its faceplate, its optics, and the flesh beneath. It thrashed for a moment, a puppet on an electrical string, then collapsed in a smoldering, twitching heap. Silence returned, thick and heavy. Jack stood over the two corpses, his breath fogging in the suddenly cool air. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum beat against the silence. He looked at the mangled, crushed remains of the scout, then at the smoking ruin of the breacher. An industrial equation. The result was satisfactory. There was no ceremony to the work. Jack fired up the plasma cutter, its hiss a counterpoint to the quiet dripping of Myrmidon ichor. He worked with the detached purpose of a butcher. He severed limbs from the two dead assassins, an arm from the crushed scout, a leg from the electrocuted breacher. The cuts were rough, cauterized black at the edges by the intense heat of the plasma torch. He didn't bother to be neat. Neatness wasn't the point. He found a standard ore crate, one of the thousands stacked around the settlement waiting for the quarterly pickup. He dumped the pieces inside, the charred limbs clattering against the metal bottom. He didn't wrap them, he didn't pack them, he just threw them in. On top, he tossed the breacher's melted helmet. Using a stenciling kit from his workshop, he sprayed a destination onto the side of the crate in bold black letters. To Myrmidon Imperial Consulate Sector 9G, Iridanus Reach. Attention, Ghost Program Director. He sealed the crate and, using a dolly, wheeled it out into the pre-dawn chill. He left it at the designated pickup zone for the automated mega freighter, right next to a dozen other crates filled with cobalt and iron. The freighter's collection AI wouldn't distinguish it from any other cargo, but Jack knew the Empire's intelligence network would. They monitored all freight traffic from worlds where they had active operations. They would scan the manifest, see the destination, and intercept the package long before it reached the Iridanus Reach. They had sent him a message with Milo's body. This was his reply. A declaration of war written in plasma cuts and scrap metal. He turned his back on the crate and walked away, the first rays of the sun casting his long, tired shadow across the red dust. They came for him in the Badlands, 3 of them this time. A new unit, specialists. He could tell by their movements. They didn't flow like the entry team. They ghosted across the cracked earth, using the terrain, moving in a dispersed triangular arrangement that covered all angles. They were trackers, hunters, and he was the prey. He led them on a chase, a carefully calculated retreat into a vast abandoned strip mine, a man-made canyon of rust-colored rock and decaying machinery. He kept his pace just slow enough to seem like a desperate flight, letting them think they were closing in, drawing them deeper into his new workshop. The first trap was simple. He'd spent the previous night planting a series of small, remote-detonated charges, scavenged from seismic survey equipment, at the base of a scree slope. As the ghosts moved into the narrowest part of the ravine, he thumbed the detonator. The explosion wasn't large, just a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls, but it was perfectly placed. Tons of loose rock and gravel cascaded down, a dusty, grinding avalanche. It didn't bury any of them, they were too fast for that, but it did what he intended. It separated them. 2 were forced to scramble up the far wall, while the third was cut off, alone on the canyon floor with him. The lone ghost was on him in seconds, closing the distance with terrifying speed. It carried a short, wicked-looking vibroblade. Jack backpedaled, luring it toward the skeletal remains of an old conveyor belt system. The ghost lunged, blade whistling through the air. Jack dropped, rolling under the strike, and came up behind a corroded support pillar. The ghost, its attack momentum carrying it forward, didn't have time to stop. It crashed through a section of rotted metal grating and landed hard on the level below. It landed exactly where Jack wanted it to. It was impaled. A 3-meter length of rusted-out rebar, which Jack had sharpened to a crude point and anchored in the bedrock, punched straight through its torso. The ghost stared down at the thick metal rod protruding from its chest, the subtle modeling of its skin convulsing in confusion before freezing into a dull gray. A high-pitched whine from above drew Jack's attention. The other 2 ghosts were already flanking him from the canyon rim. One was setting up a sniper position, the other was bounding down the rock, forced to engage him directly. Jack ignored the sniper for the moment and focused on the immediate threat. He broke into a dead sprint toward a parallel set of mining cart tracks. The second ghost was faster, its long legs eating up the ground. It was almost on top of him when Jack dove, sliding under a stationary half-full mining cart. On his way down, he slapped a magnetic detonator onto its axle. The ghost hurdled the cart, landing gracefully, and turned to finish him. Jack, still on the ground, hit the trigger. The cart's brake locks blew. 50 tons of iron ore and steel, sitting on a slight incline, began to roll. It started slow, then gathered speed with a low, groaning rumble. The ghost turned, its optics registering the new threat, but it was too late. The cart smashed into it, not with the clean finality of the press, but with the brutal, unstoppable force of pure inertia. The crunch was sickeningly loud in the enclosed space. One left, the sniper. Jack scrambled into the shadows beneath an overhanging ledge as a kinetic slug sparked off the rock where his head had been. He was pinned. He couldn't risk breaking cover, but he didn't have to. The sniper was perched on a precarious-looking metal platform, part of an old ore crushing station, a platform Jack had inspected very carefully. He pulled a small remote from his pocket. It wasn't a detonator, it was a simple activator from a high-torque hydraulic motor he'd rewired. He pressed the button. High above the sniper, a massive rusted counterweight, part of the old crusher's mechanism, shuddered. A retaining bolt, loosened by Jack just enough, sheared off under the sudden torque. The counterweight, a solid block of iron the size of a small vehicle, swung down like a pendulum of death. The sniper looked up just in time to be erased from existence. Its perch and everything on it was pulverized into scrap. Jack leaned against the rock wall, his lungs burning. 3 more down. That made 5. He checked the Colt, a reflexive, calming motion. Still a full magazine. He hadn't fired a shot. The remaining 7 ghosts were learning. Their master was unpredictable. He fought with the terrain, with junk, with the laws of physics. Surgical strikes were failing, so they changed the plan. They stopped hunting the man and started hunting the herd. The first sign was the lights flickering out across the settlement. Then the water pump sputtered and died. An attack on the town's main power generator and its water purifier. It was a classic insurgency tactic, one Jack himself had perfected. Create chaos. Turn the civilian population against the target. Pressure him, flush him out into the open. Deprive him of sanctuary and support. Miners started emerging from their hab units, their voices a low murmur of confusion and anger. They were tough, independent people, but they were reliant on that generator. Without power and water, Greaves' End would become uninhabitable in days. Their suspicion, Jack knew, would soon fall on him. He was the eye of the storm, the reason for their new misfortune. But the ghosts had made a fatal error. They assumed he cared what the miners thought of him. They assumed he needed a sanctuary. They had just turned the entire settlement into his weapon. The chaos was a perfect cover. While the miners were gathered around the silent generator, cursing and pointing fingers, Jack was moving. He slipped through the dark and narrowed streets of the cannery district, a place of abandoned warehouses and rustling machinery. He knew they'd be watching the main thoroughfares, so he took the rooftops. He found what he was looking for, a primary gas main that fed the old industrial smelters. The pipe was thick as his thigh and crusted with decades of rust, but the pressure gauges, miraculously, still showed it was live. Using a wrench and a length of stolen pipe, he created a leak, venting flammable gas into the confined space between two warehouses. He set up a simple trigger, a battery wired to a spark plug, activated by a tripwire stretched across the alley. Then he waited. Two of them came, sweeping the district. They moved low and fast, textbook urban infiltration. They passed the tripwire without seeing it. The resulting explosion was a monstrous whoomph that lit up the night. A roiling fireball engulfed the alley, incinerating the two ghosts in a plume of superheated gas and twisted metal. The shockwave shattered the few remaining windows in the district. 7 down, 5 to go. He didn't wait for the fire to die down. He was already moving toward the settlement's comms tower, a spindly skeleton of steel that rose 100 meters into the sky. He climbed, the cold metal biting into his palms. From the top, he had a commanding view of the panicked town. He didn't have a sniper rifle. He had something better, something they wouldn't expect. He braced himself against the railing and hefted the tool he'd carried up with him, a powerful, scavenged rivet gun, designed for freighter hull repair. He'd modified it, disabling the safety and bypassing the pressure governor. In place of a rivet, he loaded a sharpened 20-centimeter spike of steel, heated cherry red with a blowtorch just before his ascent. He scanned the chaos below. A ghost emerged from the shadows near the dead water purifier, its form distinct even in the dark. It was observing the town's reaction, assessing the success of its strategy. Jack took aim, leading his target slightly. He fired. The gun bucked violently in his hands, and the heated spike shot downward with a furious hiss. It wasn't silent like a sniper round. It was a falling star of vengeance. The spike struck the ghost in the shoulder joint, punching through the shell-like armor and burying itself deep in its torso. The superheated metal would have flash-boiled its alien insides. The ghost staggered, collapsed, and lay still. 8 down. He was climbing down the tower when the 9th found him. It had been stalking him, using the chaos of the explosion and the sniper shot to mask its approach. It cornered him in the darkened cantina, the scene of Brody's murder. The ghost was a whirlwind of black shell armor and bright blades. It was faster than he was, stronger. It closed the distance before Jack could bring the heavy rivet gun to bear. A blade, thin as a razor, flashed in the gloom. Jack twisted, but not fast enough. The blade sliced deep into his left thigh, shearing through muscle. A guttural cry of pain was torn from his throat. He stumbled, his leg giving way. The ghost lunged for the kill. Jack, falling, fired the Colt from the floor, not once but 3 times in a tight, desperate cluster. The booms were deafening in the enclosed space. A frantic, percussive roar. The heavy .45 slugs tore into the ghost's torso, not killing it outright, but the sheer kinetic force of the impacts was enough to halt its charge. It staggered backward, crashing into the splintered remains of the bar, where a thick shard of broken wood punched through its back. The ghost shuddered, its limbs twitching, and then went limp, impaled on the wreckage. Jack collapsed to the floor, clutching his bleeding leg. The pain was a white-hot nova. He gritted his teeth, tearing a strip of cloth from his shirt and fashioning a crude tourniquet. 9 of them were gone. 3 remained, and he had 4 rounds left. The ore processing plant was a cathedral of rust and iron, a vast, cavernous structure large enough to swallow a star freighter. Giant gears, silent for years, stood like monuments to a dead industry. Conveyor belts snaked through the gloom like metallic rivers. It was here the last 3 ghosts had made their nest. It was here they would make their final stand. Jack dragged his wounded leg through a service tunnel, the rhythmic scrape of his boot on the grated floor a painful metronome. The bleeding had slowed, but the leg was a dead weight, the muscles screaming with every movement. He was leaving a trail. They would find him. He was counting on it. He knew this team. They would be the best of the best, the final reserve, the elite of the elite. His internal assessment was cold and quick. One would be a sniper, the eye, using the plant's verticality. One would be a close-quarters expert, the blade, to hunt him in the maze of machinery. And the last one would be Terran, his prodigy. He hauled himself onto a catwalk, the metal groaning under his weight. He was a wounded animal in a steel jungle, and the predators were closing in. The game of cat and mouse began. The gash in Jack's leg made him slow, clumsy. He used the plant's ambient noise, the groaning of stressed metal, the drip of stagnant water, to mask the sound of his pained movements. He spotted the eye first, a flicker of movement on a high gantry, almost lost in the web of steel beams and shadows. The sniper was patient, choosing the perfect perch to command the entire floor, a fatal mistake. Jack limped to a control panel for one of the plant's massive magnetic cranes. The systems were dead, but the manual overrides were mechanical. He put his shoulder to a heavy lever and pushed. With a groan of protesting metal, the crane's primary electromagnet, a disc 3 meters wide, swung out over the main floor. He sighted the sniper's perch, then pulled another lever. The brake released. The magnet plummeted, its multi-ton weight dragging its chain behind it. The eye looked up from his scope a second before the magnet obliterated its perch and a 10-meter section of the gantry in a deafening cataclysm of shredding steel. The crash echoed through the plant like the death knell of a god. 1 down, 2 to go. The crash was also a diversion before the dust even settled. Jack pulled the Colt. He sighted a junction box high on the opposite wall, a critical node he'd identified earlier. He fired once. The .45 slug, loud as a cannon in the echoing space, punched through the corroded metal. Sparks flew, and a huge section of the plant was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, relieved only by the strobing, erratic flashes of the dying junction box. 3 rounds left. He moved through the strobing blackness, his eyes already adjusted. He knew the layout, but so did the blade. It found him on a narrow catwalk suspended over the primary ore crusher, a terrifying maw of interlocking steel teeth. The fight was savage. Before the ghost could close the distance to render his firearm useless, Jack raised the Colt and fired twice into the gloom. In the strobing emergency lights, he saw the first heavy slug ricochet harmlessly off the ghost's angled chest plate with a screech of metal. The second went wide as he was forced to dodge a thrown blade that whistled past his head and embedded itself in a steel girder. 1 round left. The blade was on him, a blur of motion, its twin knives weaving a web of death. Jack was outmatched. His wounded leg made his footwork a liability. He paired frantically with a length of pipe he'd grabbed, the clang of steel on steel ringing in the dark. A blade slipped past his guard, slicing a deep gash in his right forearm. The pipe went flying from his nubbed fingers. The blade moved in for the kill, its victory assured. That was what Jack was waiting for. As the ghost lunged, Jack didn't try to dodge. He stepped into the attack. He let the blade sink deep into the meat of his shoulder, a calculated, excruciating sacrifice. The ghost was now too close, its momentum committed. With a final desperate roar, Jack used his body weight, slamming them both against the corroded safety railing. It shattered. They plunged into the abyss. For a heart-stopping second, Jack was falling. Then his flailing hand found purchase, his fingers closing around a heavy dangling chain with a jolt that nearly tore his arm from its socket. He hung there, swaying over the chasm, the pain from his wounds a symphony of agony. The blade was not so lucky. Jack watched its silent, thrashing form disappear into the darkness below. A moment later, a horrific, grinding crunch rose from the depths of the ore crusher. Then, silence. 11 down, 1 to go. Jack hauled his broken body back onto the catwalk, his vision swimming. He was losing too much blood. His leg was useless, his arm a ruin. He collapsed onto the main floor, his back slumping against a giant silent gear. The plant was a wreck of fire from the sparking junction box, thick with smoke, and the screams of tortured metal. He was done. The cult lay on the floor a few feet away, just out of reach. A fire emerged from the shadows, pristine, untouched by the chaos. Tall and slender, moving with a grace that bordered on ethereal. Taryn, the final ghost. The best of them. She walked calmly through the wreckage, her weapon raised, its targeting laser a single steady red dot on Jack's chest. It was over. As Taryn looked down at the bleeding, broken old man who'd been her creator, a flicker of something alien to her programming surfaced. Not an emotion, a data fragment, a corrupted file from deep in her memory banks, a brief, fragmented flashback. The setting was a training simulation a decade ago. A younger Taryn, not yet a ghost, faced a scenario, an unarmed, surrendering political target. She had executed the target as per her orders. She had failed the test. Jack, younger, harder, the uniform of a human advisor still crisp, stood over her in the debriefing. His voice was low, cutting. "Remember this, candidate. Mercy is not an emotion. It is a weapon of last resort. You fire it only once. The result is binary: your death or the complete psychological destruction of your enemy. It is the ultimate gamble. You chose logic and you passed the mission, but you failed the war." In the present, in the ruined processing plant, the lesson's ambiguity surfaced. Her programming screamed for the kill, eliminate the target. But his words echoed, a logical paradox. Does showing mercy now make me vulnerable? Or is it the act of mercy itself, the ultimate psychological attack, the final lesson from my master? Is this the real test? The question, planted like a slow-acting virus a decade ago, was the real weapon. For a fraction of a second, the time it takes a synapse to fire, her purpose wavered. She hesitated. Jack's eyes were not clouded with pain. They were lucid, cold. He wasn't dying. He was waiting. He had gambled everything on that single fatal flaw he had built into his own masterpiece, a sliver of ambiguity. The hesitation was all he needed. His hand, which had been lying limp, shot out, fingers closing around the grip of the old Colt. He didn't aim, he didn't need to. He fired from the floor. The last bullet from his grandfather's .45. The heavy slug, a relic from a bygone era of warfare, slammed into Taryn's chest. Her advanced armor could stop a pulse round, deflect a plasma bolt. It was not designed for the brutal, focused kinetic impact of a massive piece of lead. The armor plate buckled, cracked, and the bullet punched through, tearing through her alien anatomy. Taryn looked down at the hole in her chest, then back at Jack. The subtle mottling on her visible skin spasmed once, a silent question mark. Then she collapsed. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the drip of Jack's blood on the dusty floor. He didn't know how long he was out. He awoke to rough hands turning him over. The faces of miners. Rise, Cole, a dozen others stared down at him. Their expressions weren't of pity or fear, but of a kind of grim, hard-won respect. They patched him up. They used med kits scavenged from the colony's first aid stations, stitching his wounds with unsteady but determined hands. They carried him back to his workshop and laid him on its own cot. They didn't speak of it, not a word. No questions were asked, none was needed. The evidence was all around them. The silence was its own form of understanding on a world like Gravesend. Weeks later, after Jack was back on his feet, a monument appeared in the center of the settlement. It wasn't a statue of a hero, it was a plaque with a name. It was a heavy industrial mechanic's wrench, its head half buried in the hard-packed red dirt. Wrapped around its handle, catching the weak sunlight, was a single, extraordinarily fine strand of monomolecular wire. No name, no explanation, just a silent testament to the mechanic who had cleaned his slate. The Empire never sent anyone to Gravesend again.